Hey, this is Kris Murray, and you're listening to The Briefcase with Casey Holdahl.
Greetings, Blazer fans, and welcome to The Briefcase, presented by Spirit Mountain Casino. Episode 139 of The Briefcase, presented by Spirit Mountain Casino. I am your host, Casey Holdahl, and I am in New York City with the Portland Trail Blazers, where we just arrived in preparation for a Friday night game versus the Nets in Brooklyn, the third game of a 7-game road trip. We will recap the first two games of the road trip, a victory in Utah versus the Jazz, and a victory in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. versus the Wizards. We will also discuss Shaden Sharpe's ridiculous dunk in that game versus the Wizards, the talk of the NBA, and recap, or not recap, I guess, but preview the upcoming parts of the road trip on this edition of The Briefcase, presented by Spirit Mountain Casino. Well, the Trailblazers started off their longest trip of the season, a 7-game, 2-week road trip with a 114-112 victory versus the Salt Lake City Jazz, versus the Utah Jazz in Salt Lake City. Their G League team is the Salt Lake City All-Stars. That's where we actually practiced in Salt Lake after we got into Salt Lake, which I actually talked to you guys the last time prior to the game versus the Utah Jazz. So you are aware of the practice that we had at the G League facility in Utah in preparation for the game versus the Jazz the next night. Trailblazers getting that game, as I mentioned, 114-112 in, I would say, one of the uglier games of the season for the Portland Trailblazers. Definitely not an aesthetically pleasing game, a game that they really had to grind out, a game that, they went up considerably, I believe, by as many as 13 points. Not believe, it was 13 points. They were up by about 10 points with about a minute left to play. Keyonte George hits a bunch of three-pointers towards the end of the game. Blazers have to gut out a 2-point victory and just hope that Keyonte George didn't make the third three-pointer that he attempted, which didn't. It was actually defended well by the Trailblazers anyways. But definitely one of those games where you're glad you got the win, but you didn't probably feel all that good about the way that you played in that game. And something Chauncey Billups had talked about after that game as well, was that being able to teach after a game that we won is kind of a nice thing, because, a lot of times you do a lot of teaching after losses, but you lost and you feel kind of bad about it. And, you might, I wouldn't say tread lightly necessarily as a coach, but it's like things are just going to come across differently to a player after a loss when you're kind of talking about some of the things they could have done better than after a win. And so the fact they were able to get that win and then use that tape to kind of teach some things and talk about some of the things that they could have done better, I think is a good thing. Obviously, you get the win, which you want. Trailblazers, trying to get into that 10th spot. I think they're about 4 games out right now. They're about 4.5 games out. And it seems like the teams that are in those spots, you got the Kings, you got the Warriors, you got a bunch of teams that are generally pretty good teams. One of those teams is going to have to fall back for Portland to be able to jump up unless they can go on a real winning streak. Blazers have won 3 straight now, but they're going to have to win like 7 or 8 or 9 straight, I think, to really get into that conversation. But they're trying, and so the win versus the Jazz in Salt Lake, helped get them there. Even though, as I mentioned, not a very good game for the Trailblazers. I mean, not a good game for the Jazz either, but definitely a game where it just didn't feel great. The Blazers converted 15 Jazz turnovers into 23 points. One of the reasons why they were able to get that victory. Didn't shoot well from 3, didn't shoot well, especially from the field. Just didn't really look their best at any point in time in that game. Just no real flow to that game as well. A lot of starts and stops. I think there were 2 or 3 reviews in the first quarter of that game. And that's never a good sign when the game starts off with multiple lengthy reviews. It just kind of kills any flow you might have in the building, any enthusiasm you might have in the building. And so the fact the Blazers were able to get that one, they feel good about it. You're glad you got the win, even if you didn't feel very good about the way you played. 28 points, 6 assists for Anthony Simons in that game, 18 points, 14 rebounds, 5 assists for Deni Avdija in 35 minutes, 20 points, 4 rebounds, 3 assists for Jeremy Grant, 17 points off the bench for Scoot Henderson to go with 5 rebounds and 6 assists, and 12 points off the bench for Shaden Sharp. I believe most of those points, I think, were scored in the first quarter as well. Shaden had a pretty good start to that game, kind of tailed off as it went on. But again, the Blazers able to get that victory. A lot of rebounding too. 13 rebounds for Donovan McClingan. As I mentioned, 14 rebounds for Deni, who shot just 5 of 15. But that's one of the great things about Deni, is that, even when his shot isn't going, when his offense isn't there, he always finds a way to impact the game some other way. And so going out grabbing 14 rebounds, when you're shooting 33% from the field, that goes a long way towards helping the team get that victory, which it was nice to see them get. Blazers, as I mentioned, shoot 42% from the field, 32% from 3, 75% from the free throw line. Free throw shooting is becoming a bit of an issue for this Trailblazers team. Though they did hold the Jazz to under 40% shooting and from the field, though they shot 41% from three. Also, the Jazz missing a number of players in that game as well. Most of the guys who started in that game versus the Jazz are not guys necessarily that would be playing a lot of rotation minutes, probably other places. But they were still able to get the win. And, Chauncey's talked about how, when you have a bunch of guys out, it does make the games kind of different sometimes. And I agree. There's some truth to that. But for me, too, it's like, just the idea that like this team could overlook any other team because of who they have available, I it's just hard for me to believe because I mean, we're a young rebuilding team too. And so the idea that I don't think anyone on this team thinks they can just roll the ball out and get wins. So I just think it's more that the other team just has guys who really play hard when they get the opportunities. I don't think it's so much the Blazers not being attentive enough or not being engaged enough. I just think it's more that as we see throughout the years, when guys who don't typically get a chance to play a lot of minutes do get a chance to play minutes, at least in kind of spot minutes here and there, they typically do pretty well with those minutes. And, once the scouting report catches up to them, once the season catches up, then those things typically tend to tail off. But, for 3, 4, 5 games, if you have kind of a makeshift lineup, you can generally put together something halfway decent. So not exactly surprising to see the Jazz give the Blazers a game in that one. And the Blazers, again, because Blazers are a team that's still trying to find their way as well. So Blazers do end up getting that game, even though it wasn't one of their best performances, but getting off to a good start on the road, getting that win versus the Jazz, their second straight win at that point in time, and moving on to the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., where the Blazers played on Thursday night. So the Blazers get that game versus the Jazz on Monday night, stay the night in Salt Lake City on Monday night, leave for Washington, D.C. on Tuesday, arrive in Washington in the afternoon, in the evening, I should say as well, and then play the Wizards the next night on Wednesday. And the Blazers end up getting that game as well, and a game that probably not again, not the best performance. I think the Blazers, they're kind of working through some things right now. I think they're not playing their best basketball, but they're still getting wins, which again I think is kind of a nice thing to see for a young team. And a lot of it is the opponents they're playing right now. They play the Jazz, a team that is really looking towards future seasons. They play the Wizards, another team that is looking kind of to the future and not so much to this season. Deni Avdija's return to Washington D.C. unfortunately cut short. Deni rolled his ankle, I think, in one of the first plays of the game. Came back out or went to the tunnel, went to the locker room, probably got retaped, came back out, fell again, kind of had some kind of quad issue, ended up only playing 5 games in that or 5 minutes in that game because of that injury, which is a bummer. But the Blazers still able to get that game 129-121 in Washington on Wednesday night. In a game with an announced attendance of about 13,000 people, probably one of the more sparse crowds that you're going to see in an NBA game this season. But one of the great things about DC, even when the crowds aren't that great, is like we always have such great fan support in Washington, D.C. Like there's always a ton of Blazer fans that come out to see the team and the one time they come to D.C. every year. And so it's always, regardless of kind of what the building looks like. Otherwise, you always hear Blazer fans there. You always see Blazer fans there. They're always super gracious and super happy to have a conversation. So that's one. I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite stops. I mean, DC is a great city, so it's fun in that regard. But it's nice to see Blazer fans in Washington D.C. because there's just so many of them. I don't know if it's people that work for the government, people who work for NGOs, whatever it is. But there's always a really nice contingent there, which is always really nice to see on the road. So the Blazers able to get that game, as I mentioned, 129-121 versus the Wizards on Wednesday night. 36 points from Shaden Sharp, most points off the bench for a Trailblazer since Travis Outlaw, I believe in 2004, 2007. He goes 13 of 26 from the field, 7 of 10 from the free throw line, 3 of 7 from three. Also gets 8 rebounds, 5 assists, and a steal and a block in 33 minutes. And, we're going to talk about it here in a minute, but the dunk that Shaden had in the first half of that game, one of the best in-game dunks I've ever seen in my 18 plus seasons now covering the Trailblazers. Just again, one of those performances that you love to see out of Shaden. He came out and was on fire right from the start. Definitely, I wouldn't say kept Portland in it because I don't think they were really ever going to lose that game. They trailed by 6 at one point in time. Blazers never went up by more than 18. 18 lead changes, 12 ties, particularly between the second and third quarters. Kind of a lot of back and forth between the two teams. But the Blazers able to pull that one out. As I mentioned, even with Deni only playing 5 minutes, a bit of a bummer as well. So much fan support for Deni in DC between between, the Wizards fans and I think his fellow Israelis, and then just people who he had a connection with when he played in DC. Really turned out, had a nice contingent of Deni fans there as well to go with the nice contingent of Blazer fans. Unfortunately, I didn't see a whole lot of Deni, but they did get to see, as I mentioned, one of the best in-game dunks you're going to see from Shaden Sharp. In a game too that not as disjointed as the Jazz game, but definitely not the most aesthetically pleasing game. The Wizards did end up shooting 52% from the field and 33% from three. They did turn the ball over 19 times, though, for 27 points for the Trailblazers. That was really the key to the game for the Blazers. They shot a worse percentage from the field and from three, but they had way more points in the paint, 62 to 42 advantage for the Trailblazers, points in the paint. Second chance points, almost actually even more stark, 21 second chance points for the Trailblazers, just 6 second chance points for the Wizards, and then fast break points as well. 32 fast break points for the Blazers, just 16 for the Wizards. That's the reason why the Blazers won that game, those three stats, not because of their shooting percentage, not because of their ability to take care of the ball. They had 17 turnovers that were converted into 18 points as well, but it was points in the paint, second chance points, and fast break points for the Trailblazers that carried the day. And that's something too that we're not really accustomed to seeing that in Portland. Usually, they're a team that shoots better from three, or a lot of time, in particular, like stuff like fast break points. They've been better in fast breaks as of late, but definitely not a team that has been especially dynamic in the break or in transition. And that seems to have changed over the last couple weeks, or at least they're playing better transition basketball as of late. And we saw that in the game versus the Wizards. So the Blazers able to pull that one out, and they got a little close at the end, but that one again, I didn't ever feel like the Blazers were going to lose that game. It always felt to me that they were going to be able to do what they needed to do in order to get the win. And it turns out I was right, which, it's not especially astute commentary from me. But again, sometimes, you do this long enough, you just kind of get a sense sometimes. And that's one of those games too where I was like, yeah, they're not going to lose this. Like it might be a close game. They might have to keep it close at the end, but I don't think there's really a whole lot of chance of losing this game, and there wasn't. So outside of Shaden Sharp, you had 16 points for Anthony Simons and for Scoot Henderson. Anthony also had 5 assists and 4 rebounds. Scoot also had 2 rebounds and just 1 assist for Scoot, to go with also 2 steals for Scoot in 25 minutes. 12 points apiece for Jabari Walker and Kris Murray. Both those guys had really nice games. Kris Murray, one of the players that Chauncey singled out other than Shaden Sharp. Just a really nice game for Kris, and just did exactly what we expect of Kris at this point in time, which is he might not play for 3 or 4 games. You call his number, he comes in, he gives you exactly what you need. He plays great defense. He was phenomenal defensively versus the Wizards. Does some great job on the boards as well, is able to get you a few buckets here and there. Shooting has come around for Kris too. So it's just one of those guys where it's like every time he's out there, like he just gives you something, and much in the way that you always feel Jabari when he's out there because of his physicality. I feel like you always see Kris out there because of his basketball IQ and his knowledge of where he's supposed to be and how he's supposed to play and where he's supposed to go. Like Kris is just such a smart, heady player that you always notice when he's out there. Like he just has an impact on the game, which for a head coach, I think that's the most you can ask for young guys coming off the bench, is that when you call their number, that you know what to expect from them. It's just that baseline that coaches want to have so they can depend on you for X, Y, and Z. And Kris Murray is absolutely a guy that does those things. 23 minutes for Kris, 5 of 9 from field, 1 of 3 from the 3-point line, to go with 6 assists as well with those 12 points. Jabari Walker, as I mentioned, 12 points, 4 assists, 4 rebounds for Jabari. Kind of a slow rebounding game for Jabari, probably because Kris was picking up some of those rebounds with him. Also, too, shout out to Shaden for getting 7 to 10 from the free throw line as well. The ability to get to the free throw line, I think, is going to be really important for Shaden in his career. As a guy who has just elite athleticism and just such a great feel offensively when he's really dialed in. And that was something too, actually, we should talk about being dialed in, because that was something that I know a lot of you have wanted to see Shaden start. Chauncey's been bringing him off the bench because of defense. And the first thing that Chauncey talked about after that game was he felt that Shaden was really locked in defensively. Shaden said the same exact thing. And, Chauncey was like, when you're locked in defensively, like you just kind of, you get lost in the game a little bit. And that's as a good thing, not as in losses and like, what am I doing? But lost as in like, you're just so attuned to what's going on in the game that you tend to play better. And I think, Shaden's a guy too, when he is really locked in defensively and is up to date on his assignment, where he's supposed to be, and is really just kind of focused on that side of the ball, everything else comes a whole lot easier for Shaedon. I think that's exactly what we saw from him on Wednesday night in that win versus the Wizards. He also had 15 points, 6 rebounds, an assist, and a steal for Jeremy Grant, who is now listed as questionable with some knee soreness as well. Deni Avdija also listed as questionable for the game versus the Nets with that quad contusion. They're the only two guys that are questionable. Obviously, Rob and DA and Matisse are still out for that game versus the Nets on Friday, which we'll talk about just a little bit here in a minute. And then you had, as I mentioned, 12 points for both Jabari and Kris, 36 points for Shaedon, 15 for Jeremy Grant. Toumani Camara fouled out after shooting 50% from the field for 11 points, 5 rebounds, 2 assists, and 3 steals. I was talking to Toumani after the game, and I was like, how many times you fouled out this year, Toumani? He's like, I think like twice. And he's like, but I do pick up fouls pretty fast. Now, I think he mentioned that he's among one of the league leaders, I think, in fouls this year. And, for a guy like Toumani, like that's a good thing, actually. When you're a guy like Toumani and who is a really good defensive player, guys that are really good defensive players foul. Like it's just part and parcel of being a great defender is sometimes you're going to get away with it, sometimes you're not. When you're trying to straddle that line between being physical and not getting calls, you're going to get calls sometimes. And that's what happened on Wednesday night for Toumani. As I mentioned, fouled out, but it does not at all surprise me that he would be one of the league leaders in fouls. I'm going to actually look this up. Maybe I'll write a little something about it for future editions on trailblazers.com. But that's a good thing. Again, just like you shouldn't be concerned when you have a point guard who turns the ball over. Like, the turnover leaders are all some of the best point guards in NBA history because when you're in that position, you are going to turn the ball over sometimes. If you're going to be someone that can distribute and is really good at it, they're going to look to you to do that all the time. You're probably also going to be someone that from time to time is going to have some mistakes or at least have another team that is going to be able to turn you over from time to time. So those are good things. Like it's well, not even necessarily good things, but it's an indication of what kind of player you are. If you're there, I'm guessing there's very few guys who have won all defensive honors who have I'm guessing they all average probably about 3.5 to 4 fouls a game. I'm guessing that's probably about where Toumani is at as well, and that's where he should be. And every now and then you're going to foul out, and in close games that can be difficult. Toumani's even talked about too when he picks up early fouls. Sometimes it really kind of removes some of the aggressiveness for him, and you got to kind of find that balance too between knowing like, I probably need to be a little more careful here than I would otherwise if you pick up 2 quick ones, while also realizing too that like, hey, if I'm not able to go out there and play the way that I play, I'm probably not helping my team a whole lot anyways. So I might as well just go out there and kind of live with the results. So, a nice game from Toumani as well, even if he did end up fouling out. Donovan McClingan, 4 points, 8 rebounds, 3 assists in 17 minutes. And again, when they've been getting really good production from Jabari at that backup 5, and I think that it gives them just a little bit of a different look too. When you have Donovan starting and you don't have Rob, you don't have DA, that pretty much leaves Jabari, and that when it's Rob and Donovan or DA and Donovan, those guys are different, but they're all fairly close in that they're kind of traditional NBA centers. But then when you throw Jabari out there, it's kind of a different look, like he's a guy who's a bit faster, he's a bit quicker, he's not as big as those guys, a little bit better shot, a little bit better at defending it at different places on the court, particularly on the perimeter. So when you have DC and Jabari out there as that your 1-2 punch at center, it just gives you kind of a different look, which I think there's some benefits to that. So again, an interesting game for the Trailblazers, able to get that one once again, 129-121. And to move to 2-0 on the road trip and to win their 3rd game in a row, with a chance to have a little bit of extended road trip here with a game coming up versus the Brooklyn Nets on Friday. Well, we're out here on the road, and we're out here for 2 weeks, 7 games, quite a long time. And one of my favorite things to do on the road is to find different places to eat on the road. I have places I like to go. I like places I like to try. But on this trip so far, really haven't gotten a chance to go to my regular place. I didn't get to go to my curry fried chicken place in Salt Lake City. It's a fantastic. It's so good. If you're in Salt Lake, I highly recommend checking out the curry fried chicken that's by the Grand America Hotel. Wasn't able to get to Nando's, which is a chain in DC, but it's Peruvian peri peri chicken, which is it's charred chicken with some really spicy sauce, which which I think is fantastic. Didn't get a chance to get over there, which was a bit of a bummer. But if you do head out to Spirit Mountain Casino, you can have a fantastic dining experience. Whether you're looking for a quick bite or fine dining, Spirit Mountain Casino has the food specials that you have been craving, from cheesy smash burgers to tender prime rib. Spirit Mountain Casino has everyone's favorite foods. Check out Spirit Mountain Casino, Highway 18 in Grand Ronde. Elevate your game. Well, a lot of times, when you're playing a game, you want to emphasize like the team elements of the game, but sometimes individuals do things that are so wild and crazy and just jaw-dropping that you kind of have to focus on what that individual player did. And that's exactly what we saw Wednesday night in Washington with Shaden Sharp with about 9:30 to play in the second quarter, just absolutely unloading on Julian Champagnie. The Blazers miss a shot. Champagnie gets the rebound, tries to hit the outlet pass. The Wizards trying to go fast. Shaden's kind of watching the entire time, is able to intercept the outlet pass. You got all the Wizards that are running back in transition, so no one has really a chance to kind of get back to defend Shaden except for Champagnie. And Shaden elevates from, I would say, 3 feet out of the restricted area. I mean, he had 1 foot in the paint, but it wasn't deep into the paint. And just elevates, cocks back as far as you possibly can. Like I was trying to do it. Like I can't even put my arm back that far, like straight. I'm 45, 44 years old. So, that's maybe not all that impressive that I can't do it, but the fact that he was able to pull back the way that he did and then just absolutely yammed on Champagnie just blew the doors off of the arena. The folks who were in attendance at that game in Washington on Wednesday night got an absolute treat getting to see Shaden Sharp pull off one of the best dunks you are going to see in an NBA game. And it was great too because he had a really fantastic night, but I mean, just a different level of elevation. Another dunk where I think that was maybe the second highest vert of any player in the NBA this season. I think, the NBA put out their little kind of collection of player tracking dunks this year and who's had the highest verts. Of those 5 dunks they posted, Shaden has the top 4 verts. Ja's the only guy who's in the top 5 with Shaden. Finishes that dunk and an absolutely just everything almost stops. It's like you go from watching the game to just being like, particularly as someone that creates content for the team, just being like, how can we get this stuff out there? Just giving you different angles, different calls, just a phenomenal, awesome dunk. And I would say probably Shaden's best of his career. He even said after the game he thought it was his best of his career. Definitely the best of the season. I think probably the best dunk in the NBA this season. There's always debates. And, I watch a fair amount of basketball, but, you miss some things. So I haven't seen every single dunk that's happened in the NBA this year. But I cannot imagine there have been any. If there's 1 or 2 dunks that are better than Shaden's this season, I'd be a bit surprised. It was that phenomenal as you're watching right now. And it was one of those things too, where I was like, man, the crowd, not that great. So like, I'd felt too, was like, man, good for you, Shaden. Like you gave people a reason to come to this game, and people who could have come to this game who didn't, I think probably look at it and be like, man, I wish I had been there, because 1, I could have gotten in the door pretty cheap. And 2, like you would have been able to see just a phenomenal, awesome, jaw-dropping athletic feat that you just don't get to see a whole lot. And I thought Kevin's call was great. I thought the Wizards call was great as well. And that's I tweeted that you can always tell when a dunk is fantastic. It is really a different level of dunk when the opposing teams announcers can't stop talking about it, which they ran a highlight package of that dunk, which again, like, you don't see that very often when it's the opposing team that has the highlight. But when you talk about kind of the best dunk of the year, according to the NBA, it is only the second best dunk of the year in their dunk ladder. The best dunk of the year, according to the NBA, was Quentin Grimes' dunk on Luke Kornet in a January 25th game. His score was 118.2, while Shaden's score for his dunk versus the Wizards, 113.9. The biggest issue is that in this little, the dunk score, like, I'm not even going to go into specifics about it. 1, it's completely made up, and it's a fun made up thing, but I don't know how much analytical work went into this, the dunk score calculations. But basically, Shaden gets dinged the most compared to the Quentin Grimes dunk because of the contest. They say that the defense on the Quentin Grimes dunk ranked at 81.1, whereas the defense on the Shaden Sharp dunk ranked at 61.1. if you look at that Quentin Grimes dunk, he dunks it over Luke Cornett. Luke Cornett is not I mean, like a very good positional defender in the paint, but not a guy who's going to jump to block shots. I mean, Luke Cornett's vert and my vert are probably about the same. Um, so I don't know why he's getting a full on extra 20 points for that. If you ask me, like, who would you, who is more likely to make a play at the rim in that situation, Luke Cornett or Julian Champagny? I'm going with Julian Champagny every time. And granted, he did kind of get out of the way, but Shaden still got it on him pretty good. And the elevation was way more. I mean, he had 7 more points than Quentin Grimes in terms of the elevation, 4 more points in terms of the power, less in style, which how can, again, Shaden pulled it all the way back. If basically like your chance in the ball getting falling out of your hands, or if there's anyone back there, your chance of getting slapped out of your hands, that's a better dunk. Like, and it's a good encapsulation of the limitations of stats. I think it seems to me that like we want to put a number on everything now in order to say like, well, this is the best because this is what the algorithm or the formula says. And that's not what dunks are about, like dunks are an art. They are a visceral expression of aggression on the court. They're not about numbers and verticals and putting a calculator number to a thing, to a phenomenal physical feat. Like that's, I mean, to even have a dunk score, I think it's antithetical to the notion of dunking, because again, it's like dunks live in the art world. They don't live in the analytics math world. And, so even though some stat on NBA.com says that Quentin Grimes' dunk was better than Shaden Sharp's dunks, I'd be a bit surprised if Quentin Grimes even thought about that, or even thought that, because again, like when the Quentin Grimes dunk happened, I don't remember a bunch of people freaking out about it. Like we had literally people in DC today saw people wearing Blazer gear and were like, man, that dunk last night was crazy. Like, and that's for a Wizards team that, probably doesn't have a whole lot of kind of broad fan interest right now. Um, and people still recognized it. Like, it's still, like, even in person, like, people made note of it to people on the team today. So, again, Shaden's dunk a 113.9 according to the dunk score. Quentin Grimes is 118.2. And the other thing too is that like that's almost 5 points higher than any other dunk. It's like, so the next dunk is John Collins at 113.4. So Shaden barely beating out a John Collins dunk, which again, I don't really know which one that is. Would I remember if I had seen it? Probably. Who's to say? Jalen Green, a dunk versus the Pistons on November 10th is 111.3. Then Jalen Brown, a dunk versus the Bulls, 109.6. And that was also at the end of November. So the fact that Quentin Grimes is 118.2 and the next one is 113, and the next one after that is 113, and then the next one after that is 111. If you are going to put numbers to these things, you gotta like at a certain point you have to recalculate, right? Like, and that's particularly when it's a made up stat, like it's not actually a thing. You have to actually you're giving subjective points. I mean, I think like style and power. I mean, like so jump, you can say like, well, you jumped this high, so ergo that's what your points, your score is for that. But when you're talking about the quality of the defensive contest, the style that goes into the dunk, the power that goes into the dunk, those things aren't quantifiable. So that's just someone somewhere looking at it and throwing a number out. And again, was the contest by Luke Cornett 20 points better than the contest by Julian Champagny? I don't know how you would even go about making that distinction. But I would also say no. 20 points is a lot. That's a quarter of the actual score itself. So also all these guys are right-handed too. I mean, I know there's not a ton of left-handed players, but there's though they do claim Christian Braun gets both. They say that he's the only player in the top, well, what is that? I don't know. That's probably maybe like 30 or 40 who is not right-handed. And again, most people are right-handed. When you're left-handed, you generally play baseball. And a lot of money in pitching for left-handers, but not as much in the NBA, I guess. But long story short, I don't. When something happens, and I've thought about this for other stats as well. particularly when there's stats that are created. And what I mean by that is that, when you're putting together a bunch of stats to come up with a different stat that tells you something, when that stat puts out a result that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, or is it so far out of whack with kind of some of the other contemporary things you could be grading, I think you need to go back and look at the actual formula at that point. So what I'm saying is that, yeah, like a stat that says that Quentin Grimes' dunk is better than Shaden Sharp's dunk is a stat that I think you have to question. Like, and again, I think you have to go back and say, like, well, maybe some of the assumptions we made about this formula were incorrect, because if it's telling us that this is better than that, and this sure seems like it's better than that, maybe we got to go back and kind of figure that out a little bit, or at least figure out what's going on there. Because again, that Shaden dunk is one of the best in-game dunks I've ever seen. I watched the Quentin Grimes dunk. You can go to the dunk score page on NBA.com, and you can pull up you push the play button. You can watch all of the dunks, which is a nice feature. Like the fact to have those all collected in one place, that is a cool thing. Also, by the way, too, the distance that Shaden traveled on his dunk, they have at 8.6. With Quentin Grimes, it's 5.9. I mean, he was right at the rim. Shaden had to go through the air. And as a matter of fact, of the 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. You have to go 14 dunks down on the dunk list to an Anthony Edwards dunk on January 9th, in order to get a player who traveled as far on their dunk as Shaden Sharp did. He's at an 8.6. The Quentin Grimes dunk is at a 5.9 distance. I'm guessing that's feet from the rim. Or I don't know. Yeah, that's got to be feet from the rim. Yeah, because Vert is they have Shaden at 41.1, Grimes at 33.1. So Shaden, yeah, you guys got to rethink this dunk score stat, folks, because these things just don't. It doesn't make sense. Like how can there be a 29.5 vert for Bruno? 29.5? So he must have been standing and dunked the ball, or just like hopping a little bit. Go to the dunk score. Check it out if you want to. Long story short, Shaden's was the best dunk of the year. I don't care what some stat says. And if your stat is saying that Shaden's dunk wasn't the best dunk, then you need to change your stat, because it's wrong. Sometimes the eye test is actually the better test. When it's dunking, the eye test is much in advance. I would trust the eye test much more than I would trust the stat test. So NBA.com, consider making changes to the dunk score. And before we wrap up this edition of the Briefcase presented by Spirit Mountain Casino, just wanted to run down the schedule real fast for those of you at home. As I mentioned, we are 2 games into a 7-game road trip. Trailblazers facing the Brooklyn Nets on Friday, 4:30 start time for that one back in Portland. Then they have Saturday off. It'll be a travel day. We will stay the night in New York, I would imagine. In fact, we're staying the night in New York. And then we are traveling to Cleveland for a 12:30 start time, Portland time, 3:30 start time locally on Sunday versus the Cavaliers in Cleveland, leading into a back-to-back second night, Monday versus the Philadelphia 76ers in Philadelphia. That's a 4 o'clock start time on Monday. And then we face the Boston Celtics on Wednesday, March 5th, 3 o'clock start. No, 4 o'clock start time on that one. I'm reading the East Coast times and doing the 3-hour difference in my head, and I am not that great at math after I just got done talking about how bad I think math is when it comes to defining how good a dunk is. It's not exactly easy for me as well when I'm trying to figure out what time zone I'm in, especially when we're jumping around from time zone to time zone to time zone. We're in, I think we do have all 3 time zones in this road trip as well, though I guess technically Pacific time only starts the trip when we're getting on the plane. But either way, visiting most of the time zones on this trip. So the Blazers playing the second night of it back-to-back on Monday, March 3rd versus the Sixers in Philadelphia. That leads to a game at Boston Celtics on March 5th. 4 o'clock start time is that one as well, before wrapping up the road trip on Friday, March 7th at Oklahoma City. That's a 5 o'clock start time. And so the Blazers have won the first 2 games on this trip and now have a 3-game winning streak. And they will try to go into Brooklyn in order to extend that to 4 games and remain undefeated on this trip. As I mentioned, they will be without DeAndre Ayton, Matisse Thybulle, and Robert Williams, and potentially they could be without Jeremy Grant and Deni Avdija, both of whom are listed as questionable for the game versus the Nets on Friday night. And that'll do it for this edition of The Briefcase presented by Spirit Mountain Casino. Thank you so much for joining me. As always, more editions as we continue on this long road trip, longest road trip of the season for the Trailblazers. So we do have another long road trip coming up in March as well, but this is our longest and probably one of the longer road trips in the NBA this season. So thank you for joining me. As always, please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcast, be it on YouTube, be it on Spotify, be it on Apple Music, wherever else it is. If there's anywhere else you might be getting your podcasts that aren't listed, let me know. We'll make sure we get the podcast on there as well. So we'll talk soon. Thank you for joining me. As always, I am Casey Holdahl. Go Blazers.